The wrath of God is indeed being revealed from heaven against every impiety and wickedness of those who suppress the truth by their wickedness. For what can be known about God is evident to them, for God made it evident to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes of eternal power and divinity have been able to be understood and perceived in what he has made. As a result, they have no excuse. For while they knew God, they did not accord him glory as God or give him thanks. Instead, they became vain in their reasoning, and their senseless minds were darkened. While claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of an image of mortal man, or of birds, or of four-footed animals, or of snakes. Therefore, God handed them over to impurity through the lust of their hearts for the mutual degradation of their bodies. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and revered and worshipped the creature instead of the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Therefore, God handed them over to degrading passions. Their females exchanged natural relations for unnatural, and their males likewise gave up natural relations with females and burned with lust for one another. Males did shameful things with males, and thus received in their own persons the due penalty for their perversity. Paul is a pretty rough customer, and right until the time I actually started scripting this video, I was going to give this one to the other side. Here's what we can consider to be a very early commentary on the work. This is the Apology of Aristotle, his defense of Christianity and Christians before the Emperor Hadrian of blessed memory, who was a homosexual. This is less than 100 years after Paul wrote his epistle. He's talking about the barbarians here, but don't worry, he goes after the civilized races later. He thinks they're even worse. The barbarians then, as they did not apprehend God, went astray among the elements and began to worship things created instead of their Creator. That sounds a lot like Paul. And hence, O king, we are bound to recognize the error of the barbarians, that thereby, since they did not find traces of the true God, they fell aside from the truth, and went after the desire of their imagination, serving the perishable elements and lifeless images, and through their error not apprehending what the true God is. Another obvious riff. More obvious riffs on the epistles of Romans. I won't read this. You can pause and do that if you want. Certainly anti-gay. But notice he's throwing in details that Paul does not have. These old religions were very strange. Defiled themselves with their mothers and their sisters, lying with males, of course, even slaying their parents, etc. Some polluted themselves by lying with males. For if they who are called gods practiced all these things which are written above, how much more should men practice them? Men who believe that their gods themselves practice them. Certainly again. And again, we Christians don't do this kind of thing. Well, if you're talking about run-of-the-mill homosexuality, we certainly do. Aristotle makes me look bad, but he's got a problem. He goes beyond the scope of Paul's argument. Paul is weaving together a Greek and Hebrew thread in this single passage, and I'm going to show that in both threads, he's not talking about run-of-the-mill homosexuals. Cut to the chase, he's talking about people who are making choices. He's talking about heterosexuals who are engaging in homosexual sex in a chaotic, non-loving manner, because sometimes even straight males crave male affection. He's talking about people who have abandoned the immortal for the mortal, people who've abandoned the blatant and the obvious for a vague echo, people who've abandoned the truth for a lie, people who've abandoned the natural for the unnatural for them. I know this sounds crazy, but homosexuals are not the only people who engage in homosexual sex. I had to drill this into my own head. There's even a new category that's popped up, mostly straight. Now, Paul might have had men like me in mind when he wrote this passage, but it doesn't matter, all things being equal. What matters is what the Holy Spirit told him to write down. That's the way inspiration works, and every theologian will tell you that. Let's start with the Greek thread. Paul is building on Aristotle's first cause argument, or the unmoved mover. The Romans would have been well aware of it. As is implicit in the name, the unmoved mover moves other things, but is not itself moved by any prior action. In Book 12 of his Metaphysics, Aristotle describes the unmoved mover as being perfectly beautiful, indivisible, and contemplating only the perfect contemplation, itself contemplating. Aristotle argues in Book 8 of the Physics and Book 12 of the Metaphysics that there must be an immortal, unchanging being, ultimately responsible for all wholeness and orderliness in the sensible world. Sensible. Notice Paul claims their senseless minds were darkened. Greek philosophy had uncovered this massive proof that the God of the Bible was real, and that he was exactly who he said he was. Thomas Aquinas would erect his magisterial philosophy on this foundation 13 centuries later. Yet despite the fact that everybody in the Roman world accepted this proof, there were still millions of polytheists. It is these people, and only these people, that Paul is directing his argument against. You take it as it lies. Sorry. The number one rule that I learned from taking the LSAT to get into law school is that you do not bring outside information into the argument. It's actually gotten even worse today, because back in Paul's day, everybody accepted the proof. Today, everybody's running away from it, despite the fact that they keep running smack into it. Once upon a time, with evolution and the Big Bang, there was plausible deniability about the existence of God. But now we know too much about both. We know that evolution is driven by a language spoken by living bodies. Well, how did that get started? We know that the universe is fine-tuned to support life. Well, how did that get started? So now we have all these crazy theories about brains and multiple universes and all that kind of crap. Meanwhile, I was born this way. What I am has nothing to do with this rat's nest. I would have to say, in fact, I am a natural-born philosopher. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I made a vow that I would follow the truth no matter how much it hurt. And I made the same vow about a year later. And so I agonized when I grew up later over the homosexual and the Christian. Because, hey, you can't be both. But even as a tortured teenager, I was struck by the fact that Paul insisted that these people had no excuse. And although I knew it was a key, I couldn't find a door, because I'd never heard of the unmoved mover. Aristotle confirms that I'm not reading into this. In fact, he starts the exact same way Paul does. And I perceive that the world and all that is therein are moved by the power of another, and understood that he who moves them is God, who is hidden in them and veiled by them. Paul talks about God's invisible attributes, and it is manifest that that which causes motion is more powerful than that which is moved. Okay, a little bit more from below. Form he has none, nor yet any union of members, for whatsoever possesses these is kindred to things fashioned. As we saw, the unmoved mover is perfectly beautiful and indivisible. You can look this speech up. You can extend this argument and make it a general indictment of homosexuals if you want. But if you take that extension and try to pawn it off as true Christianity, you are a fraud. Worse, a wolf in sheep's clothing. The Catholic Church insists that we homosexuals are secretly making this choice on purpose. And I thank God every day that hundreds of homosexual Christians tried for decades to prove that that was right, and they ended up proving the exact opposite. The heart and soul of this argument is conscious choice, a conscious abandonment of one's nature. You tear the heart out of this argument and you kill the argument. At least he was man enough to apologize, and he listened to everyone in that room without trying to make excuses. Also, like a real man. And now for some more irony. The Jewish thread that we see here is echoed in other parts of the New Testament, and in one spectacular contemporary instance outside of it. It doubles down on my argument that we're talking about heterosexual men having gay sex in a chaotic, non-loving manner. The Epistle of Jude only has one chapter. Me using Jude is ironic because people keep shoving verse 7 down our throats to prove homosexuality is evil, but we're going to read verses 6 and 7. They always ignore verse 6. Quelle surprise. For the angels too, who did not keep to their own domain, but deserted their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains, in gloom, for the judgment of the great day. Likewise, Sodom, Gomorrah, and the surrounding towns, which, in the same manner as they, indulged in sexual promiscuity and practiced unnatural vice, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So let's look at the footnotes. The footnote from verse 6. This second example draws on Genesis 6, 1 through 4. There was an example before this one, as elaborated in the apocryphal Book of Enoch. Jude 14 actually quotes it. Heavenly beings came to earth and had sexual intercourse with women. God punished them by casting them out of heaven into darkness and bondage. Now the footnote for verse 7. The phrase practiced unnatural vice literally went after alien flesh. Now the commentary on unnatural vice. This refers to the desire for intimacies by human beings with angels, the reverse of the example in Jude 6. Sodom, hence sodomy, and Gomorrah became proverbial as object lessons for God's punishment on sin. Oh, verse 7 starts with likewise. Angels had sex with us, and we tried to rape angels. Jude isn't talking about man on man. The language alone tells us that anyway. The word for unnatural is translated as different and strange in other translations. Unnatural is actually a terrible choice if you're dealing with an English-speaking audience because we're already mentally primed to associate unnatural with homosexuality. Not as much today as in the past, but it's still true. So I looked to see where else this word is used in the Bible, and it takes me to the book of Hebrews. When there is a change of priesthood, there is necessarily a change of law as well. Now he of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, of which no member has ever officiated at the altar. It is clear that our Lord arose from Judah, and in regard to that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. Jesus is our high priest, even though he's not from the tribe of Levi. He's from a different tribe. The angels have different flesh. They are a different species. In fact, from what I understand, each individual angel is his own species. He quotes two apocryphal Jewish works, the Assumption of Moses and the Book of Enoch. So as we see here, Jude specialized in angels. And look at what I found. Another link, the Testament of Naphtali, part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not canon, part of the Bible, but it proves Paul and Jesus' more thoughtful contemporaries were talking exactly about this kind of thing at exactly this time. The Gentiles went astray and forsook the Lord, and changed their order, and obeyed stocks and stones, spirits of deceit. But ye shall not be so, my children, recognizing in the firmament, in the earth, and in the sea, and in all created things, the Lord who made all things, that ye not become as Sodom, which changed the order of nature. In like manner, the watchers also changed the order of their nature, whom the Lord cursed at the flood, on whose account he made the earth without inhabitants and fruitless, worshipping the creation instead of the Creator, changing their natural order. Sodomites changing their order. This is explicitly linked with the watchers having sex with humans. The examples are flipped, but once again explicitly linked. This has nothing to do with homosexuality. Thus, Paul is not talking about it either. So here's what threw me into the Paul is talking about heterosexual man-on-man loving camp. You all know about Sodom and Gomorrah, and you all keep accusing us of being the Sodomites. Yet according to the Bible, all of the men of Sodom were involved in the atrocity, young and old and everyone in between. Well, if statistics from modern pornography viewership holds, that means 95% of the Sodomites were heterosexual. Looking good so far, am I not? Paul of Tarsus also had first-hand experience of exactly this kind of behavior. The emperor, Caligula, had only been dead about 16 years by the time he wrote this passage. That's the second year of the Bush administration. That's after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. Caligula had married a man and had a public wedding bed. And before him there was Tiberius, who spent more than the last 10 years of his life living in a sex palace. Now, you have a lot bigger problems than this, because the Bible never says the sin of Sodom is homosexuality. Ever. And the Bible says a lot about Sodom. Deuteronomy 29, associated with abandoning the covenant. Deuteronomy 32, again associated with going after other gods. Now there is allegedly a prohibition against homosexuality in the book of Leviticus. This is going to be very important when we look at that. Jeremiah 23, Samaria's prophets prophesy by Baal. Judea's commit adultery, walk in deception, strengthen the wicked. Ezekiel 16, the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were proud, sated with food, complacent in prosperity. They did not give any help to the poor and needy. Instead, they became arrogant and committed abominations before me. Amos 4, you cows of Bashan, who live on the mount of Samaria, who oppress the destitute and abuse the needy. The only plausible denunciation of homosexuality is Jude 7, and as I've already shown you, our critics have been lying about it. And now that I think about it, they had to lie about it because that's the only thing they had to work with. This is one of the many red flags that should tell you we have an agenda driving this theology. So we've just seen 3 examples of what I'm calling a first-century Jewish apocalyptic narrative. And we're about to look at a 4th. This one is information dense, and it comes from the Lord Jesus Christ himself. And in it, he explicitly repudiates any automatic connection between homosexuality and sodomy. But first, we're going to step back a bit and look at how the Gospels are put together. That's going to help us really work this passage. First, we have the Gospel of Mark. Mark is an amazing piece of literary genius. You might read that its Greek is crude and clunky. That's not a bug, that's a feature. Like the apocalyptic narrative we're about to read, it's a masterpiece of information-dense construction. Matthew and Luke draw from it, and from what's called the Q source, the German Quelle source, apparently a collection of sayings. These are the synoptic Gospels. That means they're seen with the same eye. Notice the sin in synoptic that's coming back around. Our outlier is John. Everyone thought John was off in Johnland somewhere and doesn't seem to have even read the other Gospels. I don't think that's true. I think he assumes you've read them, so why tell you something you already know? I also think he was dissatisfied with some of their critical shortcomings. For example, they didn't push the divinity of Jesus hard enough. But that's beyond the scope of this video. Jesus tells us what happens to Christians at the end of days. He probably says a lot about that. 2 of those narratives have survived. Mark tells us he's going to send his angels to collect us. Matthew imports Mark's verse, but that other narrative is starting to show up. Here are both Matthew and Luke side by side. Luke has the more complete cue. So let's start with that. And he said unto the disciples, The days will come when ye shall desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and ye shall not see it. And they shall say to you, See here, or see there, go not after them, nor follow them. For as the lightning that lighteneth out of one part under heaven shineth unto the other part under heaven, so shall also the Son of Man be in his day. And as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. They did eat, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage, till the day that Noah entered into the ark, and the flood came, and destroyed them all. Likewise, also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven to destroy them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. I tell you, in that night there shall be 2 men in one bed. The one shall be taken, and the other shall be left. 2 women shall be grinding together. The one shall be taken, and the other left. And they answered and said unto him, Where, Lord? And he said unto them, Wheresoever the body is, thither will the eagles be gathered. Luke was written for a Greek audience, and Jesus in Luke's gospel acknowledged as that. There's a framing narrative they would recognize. Lightning, eagles, there are missing bodies, Zeus and Ganymede. Luke doesn't mention angels because it's the eagles who will gather the Christians in this story. Of course, it'll be angels, but he's sending a message. Super gay so far, guys. Wonderful. So here's our framing narrative. Zeus, who falls in love with the young man Ganymede and abducts him. We recognize this now. Interesting differences, though. He only subtly alludes to the sexual elements in Genesis, just as he does with Zeus and Ganymede. That consistency strengthens my case. Again, I stress the linking likewise. That's integral to the received narrative. It eliminates any possibility that we're talking about homosexuality in Genesis. But because we get tripped up over this, and because Jesus is telling us something that I will build on in the sequel to this video, Jesus added this. I tell you, in that night there shall be 2 men in one bed. The one shall be taken, and the other shall be left. 2 women shall be grinding together. The one shall be taken, and the other left. The together will be a key in clinching my arguments. Notice the parallel here. Twin stories are twinned together. Noah and Sodom, men and women. 2 men in bed, assumed married. 2 women in flagrante delicto, probably also married. These are 2 gay couples. And unlike other religious leaders at the time, Jesus knew there was such a thing as gay people and was standing up for us. As I'll show you, the language will make that obvious. I also know I'm right because translators and transmitters of this text have been lying about it for God knows how long. 2 traditional English translations. The King James used by the Protestants and the Douay-Rheims used by the Catholics. The together in verse 35 is actually the Greek epito auto in the same place. It tells you that you've already been supplied with the whereabouts of these women. They are grinding in bed. I will show that's true. This passage from Matthew 24:40 has been fraudulently inserted to throw the reader off the scent. It's not in the earliest manuscripts. Again, I have no idea when this happened. I'm sure when I find the where and the when, I'll know the who and the why. This is a rapture, and the birds are eagles. The body in Matthew 24:28 is called the carcass, and the Greek eagles is therefore better translated as vultures. The parallel in the Gospel of Thomas, Logon 61a, confirms both readings. Matthew and Luke split the load. I will look at Matthew's cue later. The fraudulently inserted passage from Matthew is now being taken out of modern translations. Instead, they are purposely replacing the 2 men in verse 34 with 2 people. The Greek allows that, but the overall context of the passage does not, especially when compared to Matthew. The passage demands 2 men. Liars, liars, pants on fires. These people know exactly what they're doing, and they know that I'm right. And they better check their attitudes, because people who slander and libel Christians and undermine the faith of insecure Christians go to hell. Now, whenever this started happening, it was centuries into the Christian era. Fragment P75, about 200 AD. Impressive. The passage was not there. Vatican Codex, early 4th century. Not there. Sinai Codex, from a little later. Not there. They also took out the women. Really, in the Greek, it's very graphic if you think too hard about it. I was mortified when I first understood what this passage was telling us. I was telling people that I couldn't even look at Jesus for at least a week afterwards. I'm not kidding, I couldn't even look up from my prayers. So that's a good motive to ditch this passage completely, and I thought that's what these scribes were doing. But then I discovered that they were probably just not professionally trained. Alexandria Codex, early 400s. The two women are back, but we still don't have the insert from Matthew. Now, I said that the phrase together regarding the women tells us where they are. Let me show you how I know that. I looked up every instance in the New American Standard Bible where the word together shows up in English, and then I looked up the verses in Greek. Most of the time, it's some compound form with the prefix son. Remember synoptic? I told you it was coming back. But we're going to look at two examples of my epito auto. Let's look at that first example in Matthew, but here's the original version in Mark that he draws from. One of the scribes, when he came forward and heard them disputing, and saw how well he had answered them, asked him, "Which is the first of all the commandments?" Matthew built up the tension, just a bit. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" We have another together, but this is the Greek synagmenon, another compound. Matthew is doing this contrast on purpose. Our translations are too muddy, they need to tighten them up. How important is location in this narrative? It's of critical importance, coming in and going out. When he was going back to the city in the morning, he was hungry. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went over to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. And he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And immediately the fig tree withered. Once again, Matthew changes Mark to ratchet up the tension. In Mark, we don't see the tree is dead until they see it again later. Here, boom, Jesus isn't going to suffer any fool in the temple today. When he had come into the temple area, the chief priests and the elders of the people approached him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things?" Once again, boom, both sides are done being nice to each other. And now we're leaving. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How many times I yearned to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her young under her wings, but you were unwilling. Behold, your house will be abandoned, desolate. I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Jesus left the temple area and was going away, when his disciples approached him to point out the temple buildings. He said to them in reply, "You see all these things, do you not? Amen, I say to you, there will not be left here a stone upon another stone that will not be thrown down." Now let's go to our second example in the book of Acts, chapter 4, starting with verse 25. "You said by the Holy Spirit through the mouth of our father David, your servant, 'Why do the Gentiles rage and the peoples entertain folly? The kings of the earth took their stand, and the princes gathered together against the Lord and against his anointed. Indeed, they gathered in this city against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, Herod and Pontius Pilate, together with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do what your hand and your will had long ago planned to take place.'" In order to show that this prophecy has been fulfilled, the apostles have to show where it was fulfilled, in Jerusalem, because that's what the Greek in the scripture demands. Again, we have another compound together term, sunektheson. They're contrasting these terms again. Take the hint. Did you see what just happened here? Because I knew these were gay couples, I could leverage that sure knowledge to come to a better appreciation of something that's happening somewhere else in the Bible. The Jews who condemned Jesus to death knew who he was, because he made sure of it. He confronted all of his rivals on their home turf. He kicked their asses, and he told them they were all going to hell if they didn't change their ways, that he was going to send them there. And I didn't even notice this until I followed up on that lesbian couple. It's the same with the narrative about the Psalms. That's a big deal. Now Luke also points us towards a third gay couple. This is the first of two stories, special stories to Luke, leading into our gay rapture and pointing back to that couple. Luke 17, 7 through 10. A servant is expected to do what a servant is expected to do. You can read it if you don't want to take my word for it. Picked up immediately at verse 11 going through 19. An amazing non-Jew who has more faith than Jesus' fellow Jews. Once again, you can read it. And here's where they're pointing back to. The centurion and his servant? Not quite. A servant is expected to do what a servant is expected to do. An amazing non-Jew who has more faith than Jesus' fellow Jews. And the English hides some very interesting wordplay in the Greek. Our translations only mention servants, but the centurion calls his servant his boy, which is what men called their lovers whether they were speaking Latin or Greek, and they weren't necessarily boys. In the one spot he's called his servant, in Luke only, not in Matthew's version, he's called a dear servant. Intimos is the term God uses for his beloved son, Jesus. And this would be the only story where a non-family member comes to plead their case to Jesus, except Luke is telling us that they are family and that Jesus accepted them as family. Now I know what some of you are thinking, because I thought the same thing, that Jesus accepted a pedophile and his victim. But Luke tells us something towards the end of his gospel to let you know that just because his servant is called a boy doesn't mean he is one. Here we see Peter call the servant girl a woman. This is the famous scene where he denies Jesus 3 times. But nobody else calls this girl a woman. Nope. And nope. I think he's doing this for a reason, and for the reason why I think he's doing it. And there's more evidence for that. But to get to that, let's go back to our Q story. Let's see what Matthew does with it. The two men have moved from the bed to a field. This is the text that got falsely inserted into Luke. The two women are grinding again. Once again, the text tells us specifically where. He has modestly moved them to a mill. We have the days of Noah, but not the men of Sodom. So the link we had in the original Q text to Jude and Naphtali and Paul in Romans has been broken. And we have the eagles, but modern translations call them vultures, which is fitting since the Greek changes from bodies to carcasses, as I said. In the last days, the devil will rule the world, and he'd murder us all and send us all to hell if he thought he can get away with it. Once again, the parallel in the Gospel of Thomas shows that both elements were in the original narrative, the mass deaths and the rapture. So Matthew runs away from anything that looks gay, but not just here. He also does it towards the end of his Gospel, and he does it by telling a story different from the way everybody else does, just like Luke. Jesus tells them how to find the room for their last meal together. He tells them to follow the man carrying water in Mark, the oldest source. He tells them to follow the man carrying water in Luke, no surprise. Surprise, the man carrying the water disappears in Matthew. So why am I making this into a thing? Because carrying water is woman's work, and thus Jesus comes dangerously close to telling his disciples to follow that drag queen. Now it's time to switch gears. In order to do this video, I need to grapple with a Greek word that everyone today insists means homosexual. Except not everybody in Christian history agreed that this meant homosexual. Martin Luther thought it meant somebody who masturbated. The reality is, nobody knows what this word means. But I have an interesting idea of where it might ultimately have come from. That Greek word is arsenokoitai. No femmes, no fairies? From the site Would Jesus Discriminate? There are hundreds of Greek writings from this period that refer to homosexual activity using terms other than arsenokoitai. If Paul had intended to refer generally to homosexual sex or to one of the partners in gay male sex, he had other commonly used well-known words at his disposal. He would have had to resort to this ambiguous compound word, which future generations would find difficult to translate. So if Paul were talking about homosexuals, the Romans and the Greeks had words to describe us. This conclusion is reinforced by a survey of the actual uses of arsenokoitai in Greek literature. Scholars have identified only 73 times this term is used in the 6 centuries after Paul. In virtually every instance, the term appears in a list of sins, like Paul's, without any storyline or other context to shed light on its meaning. There are, however, a few helpful exceptions. In one instance, a Greek author uses the term when cataloging the sins of the Greek gods. In this context, the term is probably intended to refer to the time Zeus abducted and raped a young boy Ganymede. Arsenokoitai is also used in an ancient legend in which the snake in the Garden of Eden is said to have become a satanic figure named Nos. In this story, Nos is said to have gone to Adam and had him like a boy, Nas's sin is arsenokortoi. Notice, had him like a boy, just like we see in the centurion, except in a bad way. These examples suggest that arsenokortoi refers to instances when one male uses a superior power or position to take sexual advantage of another. Or rather, it became that. It started out differently. This last part, I think, is the key. The Greek author he mentions is our Aristotle, and I assume he's talking about this section here. I can't find his apology in Greek, so I couldn't confirm this. But if it's true, it's a big break for me. Hint, exclamation point, exclamation point. This word shows up in the Bible in a cultic context. We continue. This premise is reinforced by yet another translation technique. Most of the time, when arsenokortoi is used in early Greek literature, it occurs in a list of sins, just like in 1 Corinthians 6. Common experience tells us list makers tend to group similar items together. In these lists, arsenokortoi is often placed at the end of the list of sex sins and the beginning of the list of economic sins, or vice versa. For example, in 1 Corinthians 6, we find it between malakoi, which may refer to male prostitutes, and thieves. In 1 Timothy 1:10, the word appears between fornication and slave traders. This is consistent with the meaning suggested above, that arsenokortoi describes a male who aggressively takes sexual advantage of another male. Examples of this type would include a man who rapes another, or a man who uses economic power to buy sex from a male prostitute who sells his body to survive. We continue. Thus, we conclude that arsenokortoi is best understood as a reference to men who force themselves sexually on others. And once again, I would say it evolved to that, specifically among Greek-speaking Jews living among the Greeks and Romans. We've been assured with unanimous authority for centuries that Moses took a hard line against homosexuality. If a man has sexual relations with a man, as he does with a woman, both have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. Except that's not what Moses said, and that's not what he meant, and I'm going to prove it. What he did say is very weird, but pregnant with clues. There's a theory that the Greek translation of this injunction is the origin of our very strange word, and I agree. Arsenos koitein. I was confident Moses was actually talking about male temple prostitutes, and I was going to run with that, but I couldn't clinch the argument, and I would have admitted it, until I stumbled on this Jason Minion post at the last minute. I was already well into filming this video when I gave DuckDuckGo one last try. I've used DuckDuckGo more than a year now, and I don't miss Google at all, by the way. Following the link he gave me, I can see that in English, the actual translation should be something like, if a male has sexual relations with a male beds with a woman, both of them have done what is ritually detestable. They're to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. I've marked the male beds of the woman. That's going to be very important. And notice I said ritual abomination or abhorrence, because it is. And of the 10 laws in chapter 20, which will get you executed, and chapter 20 is an expansion of chapter 18, this is the only one that's explicitly called an abomination or an abhorrence. And one of the laws is against sex with animals. Take the hint. Now I know the ancient Israelites love their puns, and the woman is transliterated here as Asherah, which instantly reminded me of Asherah, the mother goddess that the Hebrew prophets were constantly railing against. We now know that at the time she was called Yahweh's Asherah, his wife. You can actually see that written down on pottery and stone that survived from the time of the kingdom. But I would assume we're looking at a temple gigolo in the service of Asherah, which is why I would translate this as the woman rather than just woman. Now, if you study Near Eastern Iron Age archaeology, you might be familiar with the motif of the woman in the window. The Bible is aware of her. She's treated as high-cultured, vain, and dangerous. So our temple gigolo had an actual female counterpart, Jezebel. And since his client was a man, and men bore culture, his behavior would be seen as especially dangerously subversive by God, just like Jezebel. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go to hell. You lie down with dogs, you get fleas. God did not command this because he's a tyrant. He commanded this because back in the day, that was the only way to get rid of the fleas. And next thing you know, everybody has fleas. God is the conqueror of death. I trust his judgment in these matters without question. Now, let's take a quick look at some of the many ways homosexual slanderers have been abusing the Bible, and along the way subverting continuity and theological clarity, just like Jezebel. First, let's look at Toeba, the ritual abomination or abhorrence. According to these guys, it has two different senses. I call bullshit on that. They say that because they hate gay people. Toeba is Toeba. Start with the theories that make the fewest assumptions, boys, unless you think having sex with a dog or a cow is better than having sex with another man. Homosexuality is especially bad, therefore Toeba must have two different meanings. Toeba has two different meanings, and it is a second, harsher meaning that applies to homosexuality. Circular reasoning bullshit. Toeba means contrary to order, and is consistent with the classification of the Canaanites as liminal barbarians outside the bounds of order. We see a similar sentiment in Genesis 46:34, where all shepherds are Toeba to the Egyptians. Being a shepherd is as bad as being a fag. Unless you prove outside of your homosexual arguments that Toeba has two different senses, that's what we're stuck with. Toeba, deviation from established order, is always relative to the order in question. Toeba described in Deuteronomy is detestable behavior if the Israelites do it. The emphasis is on what Israel is not supposed to do, not on what the Canaanites should be or were punished for doing. So even if this were about homosexuality, and it is not, this would not apply to anybody who's not a Jew. I think every Christian and Christian critic should read The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest, and then they should read it again. It was written by a father-son duo. Here's the father. You can pause and read about him. And his son. Here's how the book got started. You can pause and read this if you want. This was an honorably gained accomplishment. I think the whole work is an amazing breakthrough. Before I read Menayen's comments on this passage, one of the reasons why I knew it had to be talking about temple gigolos is because the later Israelites had problems with them. And most importantly, historical critics of us homosexuals were lying about that. And that's turned into a red flag with me. English-speaking Protestants and Catholics were both lying. 1 Kings 15:12. The English Standard Version says King Asa got rid of the male cult prostitutes. The Protestant King James says he got rid of the sodomites. The Catholic Douay-Rheims says he got rid of the effeminates. The modern translators are right. The older translators were lying. They were not mistaken or confused. Opinions did not differ. They knew damn well this passage was not talking about the people that they call sodomites or effeminates. Here's how I know. First, look at the Hebrew. I don't read Hebrew, but I instantly recognize the root Qodesh in ha-kedoshim, because I've been studying Qodesh. It means holy. It will further confirm that this has nothing to do with eternal moral values, including wicked homosexuals. Here we see the same root used in ha-kedoshim. In the Semitic language, a root word is a collection of consonants. Who it's used for, or who it belongs to, or who it's done to, all depends on the vowels that are added to it. That's one way I know they were lying. Here's another. This is the Septuagint again, the Greek translation of the Bible. This is important because where English translations differ, this can be considered a 2,200-year-old Jewish commentary. I can't read Greek either, but I can use online translators to break down individual words. Not seeing anything about sodomites or cult prostitutes, I asked Demetrios A., a Greek viewer of my videos, to translate the passage for me. It starts, and he abolished the idolatrous rituals from his country. He'd added a spin to it from the context, and we understood why I needed this translated, and as you can see, I didn't tell him so I wouldn't influence his translation. He translated it more literally. And he abolished the rituals. There's no way these trained professionals missed this. Now let's go back to our Leviticus passage. They'd been lying about something else, this time the language itself. Turns out, the site that I'd been using to query the language pulled a fast one. We know from Menayen that the phrase is actually, man shall not lie with male beds of woman. Well, that's not what they told me, and that's not the assumption that I've been working with. Now you're about to find out why I got stuck. Here they're saying, as those who lie. This exact turn of phrase also turns up in Genesis 49:14, but with father, the bed of your father. They didn't have any trouble translating it here. So now we have to read this passage in Genesis that we're looking at here because it points right back to a lot of the stuff I've been covering. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. Reuben had had sex with his father's concubine, and on his deathbed his father Jacob is still holding it against him. Now the ancient Hebrews loved puns, and another thing they loved is parallels. For you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. That reminded me instantly of the Gospel of Thomas passage I'd read earlier, because half the time the passage is translated as couch and not bed. In all translations, Jesus has a follow-up conversation with Salome concerning her couch. So we have couch and bed paralleled, male beds of woman, male bed of woman. The Greek preserves the ambiguity, but it uses a singular for bed instead of a plural, which further confirms to me the Hebrew is referring to institutional cult prostitution. The priests probably had them lined up in beds in squalid rooms like shop workers, probably availed themselves of their labor too. So all this time, we're arguing over the weird term man bed, when Leviticus was always talking about beds of the woman. Male beds of the woman. Male bed of woman. Men bed women. Continuity restored. Theological clarity restored. Satan's works thwarted. Finally. Now you see why they had to lie about that passage. If they let on that it really said something like a man shall not lie with male beds of woman, we would have been struck by its clumsiness and ambiguity. And we would have wondered if they were talking about something that we don't do anymore. And we would have been right. But by drilling it into our heads that the phrases a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman, they herd us to an obvious conclusion. A conclusion that we cannot get unstuck from our heads. This is something that you do on purpose. Now, as I've just shown you, Jesus went out of his way to make it super duper clear that this passage specifically, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, has nothing to do with homosexuality. And this is one of the many reasons why I know he really is the Son of God. Now, if you want to deny my case so far, you're just being stubborn. But you cannot deny it after I show you how Minion took the case over the top to show that we're talking about temple gigolos. And in fact, he uncovers an especially infuriating example of the calculated campaign of slander and libel that's directed against gay Christians. Now he points out that there are 10 infractions in Leviticus 20 that are denounced and given the death penalty. They're also in Leviticus 18, but Leviticus 20 expands on their seriousness. Now there's another book, Deuteronomy, literally second law. This is the treaty between God and the Israelites. And in this treaty, God denounces all 10 of the infractions from Leviticus 20. Except for the law against homosexuality, because there is no law against homosexuality. That law is about temple prostitution, which as you can see is clearly forbidden in Deuteronomy. And oh my goodness, just look at those anti-gay apostates get to work on this one. Here you see that the site that I've been relying on heavily before I found Menian has pulled another fast one. Here's the actual sacred script. Don't let your daughters become Qodesh or your sons become Qodesh. You don't need to know what this is to know that you're talking about male and female versions of the same thing, Qodesh or holy. We're going to take a quick look at what it meant to be holy back in the day in a second. So, the Protestants say, don't let your daughters become whores and your sons become fags. Is a whore and a fag the same thing? And the Catholics say, don't let your daughters become whores and your sons become whoremongers. A whoremonger and a whore is not the same thing, and a whoremonger and a fag is not the same thing, and neither has anything to do with the actual Hebrew word. Unless you up and decided to do for Qodesh what you did for Toeba, that is, pull a brand new definition for it out of thin air. Now, we need to get to the bottom of what it meant to be holy to these people. And once again, the lost world of the Israelite conquest comes to the rescue. It also helps us understand what it means to be clean. The abuse of these technical ritual terms has been a catastrophe for Christian theology and for gay Christians. The so-called Holiness Code that contains Leviticus 18 through 20, 18 and 20, is often interpreted as a list of divine demands that constitute God's mandatory moral standards. These interpretations are misguided because the text in context is not intended as a litany of moral instructions. Instead, it falls into a genre of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature called legal wisdom. One thing we moderns still circumscribe in this way is art. The law contained in the ancient treatises are not a list of bullet points that someone can follow in order to produce justice. Instead, they instruct the potential judge as to what justice looks like, so that the judge will know it when they see it. So if you're a high school kid and you fall in love with the quarterback of the football team, and who doesn't, you are not in violation of the covenant. But if you are into the porn industry, and you are using pornography to attack Christianity and Christian culture and Christians, you are in violation of the covenant. Legal treatises do not document moral commands or moral violations of any kind. Nonetheless, those passages exist for a reason, and they were documented and preserved for a reason. What that reason is, and what purpose these passages serve, we will examine in the next proposition. When Israelites are unfaithful to the Torah, they are not breaking God's universal moral law. They are breaking the covenant. As discussed in Proposition 8, Canaanites cannot break the covenant because they are not in a covenant relationship with Yahweh. The word translated holy, Hebrew root Qodesh, cannot possibly mean having a certain moral character. Basically, if we knew what the Bible meant when it called something holy, we wouldn't have been surprised by a concept of a holy prostitute, and we wouldn't have confused a holy prostitute with a run-of-the-mill homosexual. Now let's see how cleanliness works. The concept of cleanliness is connected to the idea of suitability for cultic ritual use or participation. Clean, tahor, cannot mean moral for the same reason that holy, kadosh, cannot. Humans can make themselves clean or unclean, but holiness is a status that is conferred by God. It cannot be earned or acquired or lost through behavior. The actual wording of Leviticus 19:2 bears this out. The Hebrew simply says, "You will be holy because I am holy." The grammatical construction can carry an imperative mood, but not necessarily so. It can say, "You will be holy because I am holy," or it can just simply declare it. Which is right? The Septuagint uses an indicative form of the verb, eseste, rather than the imperative. So the Septuagint agrees with the authors that this is not a command, this is just a statement of fact. Very important. A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he scattered it, some fell along the path. It was trampled on and the birds ate it. Some fell on rocky ground. It came up, but the plants withered because there was no moisture. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up with it and choked the plant. Other seeds fell on good soil. It came up and produced a crop, 100-fold more than was sown. When he said this, he called out, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." The parable of the sower. The hard ground is a hard heart. The rocky ground is the shallow heart. The thorny patch is the distracted heart. All of these people are going to hell if they don't change their ways. I bring this parable up because there's a Greek word that everyone keeps translating as homosexual. Malakos, soft, effeminate. But that's a well-known Greek insult. Jesus told us who the Malakos are. They are the people with the shallow hearts and the distracted hearts. They don't have the strength of character to hang on to their own salvation. My niece's ex-husband is effeminate. RuPaul is not effeminate. I am not effeminate. We are homosexuals. Now, I've talked about from the very beginning how the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not about homosexuality, and how the Bible doesn't even mention us homosexuals until Jesus. But now we have to ask two questions. If the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not about homosexuals, then what is it about? And why are there homosexuals? Well, it turns out these two are connected, and if you answer one question, you're going to be halfway to answering the other. Let's go back to the lost world. The cognitive environment of the ancient Near East, however, did not hold human happiness as the highest ideal. Their highest ideal is probably best described by our English word order. For ancient Near Easterners, a thing was good not based on the extent to which it produced human pleasure or alleviated human suffering, but the extent to which it was functioning as it was intended to. Thus, when the Bible wants to depict something as good, it describes that thing in terms, concepts, and illustrations that the ancient world associated with order, not in ways associated with human happiness. Consequently, things that the Bible portrays as good do not always correlate with the things we associate with human happiness. The principle of chaos is commonly represented in ancient Near Eastern literature by the personified ocean, Ugaritic Yam, Hebrew Yam, or by the monstrous serpentine or draconic creatures, Ugaritic Litan, Leviathan in Hebrew, or both at once, Akkadian Tiamat. Occasionally, the triumph of order over chaos is depicted in terms of combat, as in the famous Babylonian cosmogony Enuma Elish. The thematic motif of order battling chaos, literally or figuratively, is referred to by scholars as chaos kampf. I think 2 Peter 2 sums up the Sodomites very nicely. They are lawless. So Sodom and Gomorrah is chaos kampf. Order collapses, boundaries are erased, nothing works as it's supposed to. Order is very important in the Old Testament. It drives every story in it, from the creation to the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonian Empire. The entire point of the lost world of the Israelite conquest is to show that Joshua's conquest is the retelling of the creation of the world, and it ends when King Solomon builds his temple, which is based on the Garden of Eden. Sodom and Gomorrah is the existential element that afflicts the world, the element that God is going to fix. Now, the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt is about the unraveling of order. We start with preeminent order, Pharaoh in Egypt, the greatest empire of its day, and we end, as we began, in darkness and death. We homosexuals are not chaotic by nature of our sexual orientation. Generation in, generation out, we're 2 to 3% of the population. But in order to be truly good, as God means it in Genesis, we have to have what Aristotle calls a final cause, a purpose, and we have to fulfill that purpose. Now, I can't speak for lesbians, but we homosexual males seem to show up to relieve stress, and we are created for this. Our mothers might be carrying us during a war, and we might have a lot of brothers ahead of us, so we need to ratchet down the competition. Also, I think we're looking at something of an engineering trade-off here. There are 2 things that we humans do that use a lot of energy. We have children and we have big brains. The less likely you are to deal with children, the bigger your brain can be. So, heterosexual men are smarter than heterosexual women. Their brains are bigger and they're more densely packed. I know you don't want to hear that, but the IQ tests you're hearing about were given to 11 and 13-year-olds. Girls have had a growth spurt. They've had an advantage over boys at that time. Give them to 15-year-olds and you'll see very different numbers. And judging by professional credentials, we homosexuals tend to be smarter than heterosexuals. That's why there are so many gay priests. It's an intellectually demanding field. For one thing, you have to study Aristotle, and after him, Thomas Aquinas. Now, according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we are disordered. But that's not true. We are diverted. It is the situation that we find ourselves in, thanks to churchmen of all stripes, that situation is disordered. When we are allowed to fulfill our final cause, without being alienated from our families and from our church, we're a lot like the water people use to prime a pump. You don't drink that water. You pour it down the pump to create a vacuum so you can bring up more water. It's not a lot of water. And we're not a lot of folks. 2 to 3% of the population. We're not likely to take any genetic material with us to the grave. You can get it from our cousins. But we do produce children in a way, intellectual and cultural children. And we make it a better world for you to raise your babies in. Also, we live the way everybody's going to live after the resurrection. So we're kind of a preview of the world to come. Now, Western civilization, in my opinion, is an example of what you get when we homosexuals are allowed to fulfill our final cause. It is the most energetic and creative civilization in the history of the world. Nobody comes close. It has all sorts of open homosexual participation. It's the only one for which that is true. Take the hint. But you know what? Even if everything I just said is wrong, it doesn't matter, because Jesus told you to stop bad-mouthing us. I've been trotting out the pro-gay Q source from Luke for quite a while now, but in this video, I've connected it to a larger narrative. I never saw that coming, and it just proves that I was right all along. At the end of the day, the entire biblical case against us homosexuals is a pack of lies, told by people who once upon a time had a monopoly on the theology, and now they're throwing a fit because they don't have that monopoly anymore. On the other hand, my reading of these texts is not only superior to theirs, but my reading of these individual texts brings greater theological clarity and continuity to the entire Bible. That is a big deal. But I'm not done talking about gays in the Bible yet. In this video, what I've done can be compared to taking down some ugly old wallpaper in a charming old home and discovering underneath it the hitherto unknown, fabulous original fresco of a master. In this case, a master of intergalactic renown. In the next video, I'm going to show that we homosexuals are the foundation of an entire line of theology dealing with death, resurrection, the rapture, and the ultimate fate of God and man.